Tameshi, Reality Architect, is an anime cyberpunk moonfolk wizard coming soon in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Tameshi cares about landfall, bounce, artifacts, enchantments, and your graveyard, and with a resume like that, why wouldn't you want to build Tameshi to lead your next commander deck? Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and on this channel, we like to discuss unconventional commander decks and strategies. But before I get to that, the Commander's Beacon recently launched a Discord server. Come and join us and discuss unique ways to play Magic the Gathering's best format, or maybe play some games. The Discord server is open to everyone, and you can find the invite link in the description. And now let's get back to today's topic. We have a spoiler from the upcoming Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. It's Tameshi, Reality Architect. Tameshi is a 2/3 Moonfolk wizard that costs 2 and a blue. It has whenever one or more non-creature permanents are returned to hand, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And also, pay X and a white and return a land you control to its owner's hand. To return target artifact or enchantment card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. Now, before we get into why you should build around Tameshi for your next commander deck, first let's break down these two abilities. With this first ability, Tameshi can draw you up to 1 card on each player's turn. In other words, up to 4 cards for each round of the table in a 4-player game. In order to get this, you need to have a non-creature permanent returned to hand. Now, the way this is worded is new for Magic and is a bit ambiguous, but I believe Tameshi will draw you a card whenever any non-creature permanent is returned to its owner's hand for any reason, once per turn anyways. And this ability will trigger even if it's one of your opponent's permanents being bounced, and even if your opponent controls the ability that is returning the permanent to someone's hand. At least that's the way that I think Tameshi works, but let me know if I'm wrong. Now, Tameshi's second ability is much more straightforward. At sorcery speed, you can pay some mana and bounce a land to your hand to return an artifact or an enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Tameshi draws you cards, which is pretty standard in blue. The way in which he does so is kind of like Baron, Tolarian Archmage, except that Tameshi is, for the most part, much more flexible, and the ceiling is 4 cards per round of the table instead of just 1 with Baron. Keep in mind, though, that Tameshi only cares about non-creature permanents being bounced, so that is a bit of a limitation. Now, Tameshi also cares about artifacts and enchantments, which is also pretty standard in blue and white. Now, Tameshi's activated ability lets you recur artifacts or enchantments from your graveyard directly to the battlefield, which makes it a mostly better Hana Ship's Navigator. But keep in mind that you need to bounce a land to your hand in order to use this ability. A deck with Tameshi in the command zone will have access to blue and white, so your ability to deploy additional lands to make up for the ones that you're bouncing back to your hand may be limited, so just be aware of that. Also, while you can use Tameshi's ability the turn it comes into play because it's not a tap ability, you can only use it at sorcery speed, which is also another limitation. Nonetheless, Tameshi has a lot of flexibility to be built in several different ways. You can focus on Tameshi's first ability or second ability or the interplay between them, since activating his second ability returns a land to your hand, which will trigger his first ability. So let's go over some of the many ways that you might want to build around Tameshi, Reality Architect. Now, one obvious way to build around Tameshi is a Landfall deck. Now, this is pretty interesting since most Landfall decks will have access to green, but white and blue do have some access to decent Landfall payoffs. The Felidar Retreat can make 2/2 cats or grow your team. Emeria Angel can also make token creatures for you, as can Retreat to Emeria, which is an older and non-power crept version of Felidar Retreat. If you're desperate, you can try to mill out your opponents with Ruin Crab and Hedron Crab. Actually, Hedron Crab can mill any player, so you might target yourself to fill your own graveyard with Reanimator targets for Tameshi. There's also Trove Warden and Emeria Shepherd, which give you access to even more graveyard recursion. And you can use things like Retreat to Coralhelm or Guardian of Tazim to tap down your opponent's things, or Royal Elemental to just steal them. So there are some pretty decent landfall payoffs in Azorius colors, and with Tameshi's activated ability, you'll be able to ensure that you can play a land on every turn. In other words, you'll never miss a land drop. so that you can maximize those landfall triggers. But if you actually want to gain more lands on the battlefield over time, you'll need some way to make extra land drops to offset the ones that you're bouncing back to your hand. Access to this effect is very limited in blue and white, so I expect that most Tameshi decks using this strategy will end up running the same cards. Like Walking Atlas, which can tap to let you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. Terrain Generator can do the same thing on a land for 2 mana. Patron of the Moon is very efficient, letting you put up to 2 lands from your hand into play for just 1 mana. You can even sacrifice Tameshi to reduce Patron of the Moon's mana cost from 7 to 4, if you want. There's Scare Tiller, which can put a land from your hand into play when it becomes tapped. Now, you might not play any effects that tap artifacts in this deck, except maybe that Retreat to Coralhelm, but you could just attack with Scare Tiller. And if it dies, well, it's an artifact, so Tameshi can bring it back from your graveyard. Not super efficient, but it's a neat little value engine. But my favorite way to redeploy our bounced lands is Archaeomancer's Map. This lets us put a land from our hand into play whenever one of our opponents plays a land, as long as that opponent has more lands than us, which they very likely will, since we're bouncing our lands to our hand. Archaeomancer's Map is even an artifact, so if someone destroys it, you can use Tameshi to bring it back from the graveyard. Finally, you can use Tameshi's second ability to help you generate landfall triggers in a different way. Surveyor's Scope and Wayfarer's Bauble, for example, are inexpensive artifacts that sacrifice themselves to dig lands out of your deck and put them onto the battlefield. Surveyor's Scope lets you search for up to X basic lands, where X is the number of opponents that have at least 2 more lands than you, which again should be most players since you're bouncing your lands to your hand. And Wayfarer's Bauble can be sacrificed to find a basic land and put it into play. And Tameshi's second ability lets you recur these artifacts from your graveyard to use them over and over again. Just make sure you include enough basics in your deck to make it worth it, because you will be using these ramp pieces more than once in this deck. Now, if you read Tameshi's second ability carefully, you'll notice he can't just bounce lands to your hand whenever you want. You need to have an artifact or enchantment in your graveyard to target. And you need to pay mana equal to that permanent's mana cost, plus an additional white. So if you focus on Tameshi's ability to bounce lands, you'll need a decent number of artifacts or enchantments to target, perhaps even low-cost ones to make this ability affordable. And this brings us to another way to build around Tameshi, by focusing him on graveyard recursion. There are plenty of artifacts and enchantments that make great recursion targets. Like Mystic Remora, which costs only a single blue mana and taxes your opponents for casting non-creature spells. And you draw cards if they don't pay the tax. Mystic Remora also has a cumulative upkeep, so you can just sacrifice it to keep the upkeep cost down, and then use Tameshi to recur it and effectively reset its age counters. Now, the last thing your opponents will want to see is a Mystic Remora that sticks around all game. That's basically an upgrade to Rhystic Study, which is nuts. We can also play around with other artifacts and enchantments that naturally sacrifice themselves, and we can even fit our Landfall theme in here as well. Ior Ruin Expedition has Landfall. It gets a quest counter whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, and you can remove 3 quest counters from it and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. And again, bounce a land from your hand to recur Ior Ruin Expedition from your graveyard to the battlefield with Tameshi to keep the landfall value going. Sunspring Expedition is similar. For just 1 white mana, this enchantment also gets quest counters when you have lands enter the battlefield, and you can remove 3 quest counters from it and sacrifice it to gain 8 life. Now, just gaining life for the sake of gaining life is typically not great, but this enchantment is cheap, so Tameshi can recur it easily. And again, you need a target in your graveyard to be able to use Tameshi's ability to bounce lands, and so Sunspring Expedition is an efficient one. Now, as long as we're putting enchantments into the graveyard, we need to talk about sagas, because those will put themselves into the graveyard, eventually. There are plenty of decent value sagas that get even better when you can recur them. From low mana value sagas like The Birth of Meletis, to the new Michiko's Reign of Truth, to more expensive powerhouses like Kiora Best's the Sea God, which will make you 8/8 Kraken tokens and permanently steal stuff from your opponents. Now, when we move on to artifacts, the card pool of artifacts that sacrifice themselves and that like to be recurred from the graveyard is very deep, especially in blue and white. I'm not going to try to list them all here, but take a look at Courier's Capsule and Dispeller's Capsule, for example, which are card draw and removal on artifacts that Tameshi can recur from your graveyard again and again. Now, as long as we're bouncing lands to our hand, we might focus on bouncing specific lands that give us added value when we replay them. The most obvious of which is Mystic Sanctuary, which returns an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand when it enters the battlefield. Or of course, Urza's Saga, which is both a saga and a land, so Tameshi can both bounce this one from the battlefield and recur it from the graveyard. Yes, it's over $40, but if you're not building on a budget, Urza's Saga definitely needs to go in this deck for generic value. But we don't need to stop there. Field of the Dead can make a ton of zombies in a deck like this, where we're continually redeploying our lands. Halimar Depths can do a weak version of Scry 3 repeatedly. There's janky cards like Saprazin Scary, which I don't even know what that means. Enters the battlefield untapped with 2 depletion counters on it. You can tap it and remove a depletion counter for 2 blue mana, and if it has no depletion counters left on it, you sacrifice it. But if you just bounce it after using its first depletion counter with Tameshi, you basically always have a land that taps for 2 mana. Now you can also gain access to temporary mana fixing that can become permanent mana fixing with Tameshi, like Tendo Icebridge and Aether Hub, which lets you tap them and remove the single counter that they come with to make a mana of any color. But if you bounce and replay the land, you can repeatedly get that color fixing. Thalicos Lowlands function similarly. Now, if you're not on a budget, I wouldn't stretch as far as to play these types of lands just for color fixing, but they could be a neat little trick if you're playing a budget deck. And finally, we want to look at artifact lands that have some added functionality, because Tameshi can recur these from your graveyard with his second ability. Now, the only important land in this category is Treasure Vault, which lets you pay XX and tap and sacrifice it to make X treasures. So because it's an artifact, then Tameshi can recur it from your graveyard for just a single white mana, and bouncing another land. So you can start to see how many options we have when building around Tameshi. But we're not done yet. Remember that Tameshi's first ability draws you a card whenever a non-creature permanent is returned to its owner's hand. Again, at least I think that's how it works. So you can bounce your opponent's non-creature permanents as a form of control, and you'll be rewarded with card advantage when you do so. So there's just good synergistic removal like Into the Royal, Callous Dismissal, Brazen Bowrower, which can bounce your opponent's things. And these are all instant, so you can use them during your opponent's turn and get as many card draw triggers from Tameshi as possible. There's things like Blood Clock and Umbilicus, which sort of do the work for us each and every turn. These artifacts make each player return a permanent they control to their hand at the beginning of their upkeep, or pay 2 life. And there's also, shall we say, more restrictive ways to ensure that our opponents are returning things to their hand as well. Mana Breach is an enchantment that says whenever a player casts a spell, that player returns a land they control to their owner's hand. This is virtually guaranteed to draw us cards, and make everyone at the table angry. Storm Cauldron says whenever a land is tapped for mana, return it to its owner's hand, so we'll draw even more cards. It also lets each player play an additional land during their turn, which is great for us if we're playing with Landfall. And Words of Wind is hilarious. This enchantment lets you pay 1, and the next time you would draw a card this turn, each player returns a permanent they control to their owner's hand instead. So let's say you're about to draw a card, Tameshi and Words of Wind are on the battlefield, but you say, you know what, instead of drawing a card, I'll pay 1, and all players have to bounce a permanent to their hand. Oh, but if anyone bounces a non-creature permanent, I'll get to draw that card anyways, so this is great. Now if you want even more options when building around Tameshi, don't forget about the Moonfolk tribe. These creatures all let you bounce lands to your hand for some effect, like Meloku the Clouded Mirror, which lets you pay 1 and bounce a land to your hand to make a 1/1 blue illusion creature token, or Soratami Rainshaper, which lets you pay 3 and bounce a land to your hand to give a target creature you control Shroud until end of turn, or Uyo, Silent Prophet, who lets you pay 2 and bounce 2 lands to your hand to copy a target instant or sorcery spell, and you can choose new targets for the copy. Now these other Moonfolk will give you even more ways to bounce lands to your hand for value, and to trigger card draw from Tameshi. Just be sure to have enough of those cards that let you redeploy lands from your hand, which are again somewhat limited in these colors. And the last thing I want to mention about Tameshi is breaking its ability to return artifacts or enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. Since the cost for this ability scales with the mana value of the card you're recurring, you might be able to generate infinite resources with very low cost artifacts. For example, with Tameshi, Retreat to Coralhelm, Walking Atlas, and a 0 mana artifact that produces mana, like Lotus Petal, you can generate infinite mana. Just sacrifice the Lotus Petal to put it into your graveyard, pay 1 white mana, and bounce a land that produces white mana with Tameshi to put the Lotus Petal back into play. Now if you've already made your land drop for the turn, you can tap Walking Atlas to put that land you bounced back into play, That land will trigger Retreat to Coral Helm, letting you untap Walking Atlas. Then you can sacrifice Lotus Petal for another mana of whatever color you want. Tap the land you just deployed with Walking Atlas for white mana and use that mana to activate Tameshi and recur the Lotus Petal again. Use Walking Atlas to redeploy the land, and Retreat to Coral Helm untaps Walking Atlas, and so on. But you can also use Tameshi to break this series of artifacts that can't be cast. They can only be suspended. The most iconic of these, and the most effective, is Lotus Bloom. This artifact has Suspend 3 and no mana cost. That means you can't cast it, you can only suspend it. And once it's in play, you can sacrifice it for 3 mana of any one color. So once it's in play, it's basically Black Lotus. But if Lotus Bloom is in your graveyard, Tameshi can return it to the battlefield with his second activated ability. And he'll do so for only 1 white mana because Lotus Bloom has a mana value of 0. So you can swap Lotus Petal in the previously mentioned combo for Lotus Bloom and generate mana even more easily, well, as long as you start the combo with Lotus Bloom in play or in your graveyard, since you can't just cast it from your hand, you can only suspend it. Now you can use Mox Tantalite or Soul Talisman in the same way. Sort of. These artifacts tap for 1 or 2 mana respectively, but again you can't cast them, you can only suspend them. But Tameshi will again see these as 0 mana cost artifacts in your graveyard, allowing them to be returned to the battlefield for only 1 white mana. But since these artifacts don't sacrifice themselves, you'll need another combo piece. That is, any repeatable use free artifact sacrifice outlet, like Krark-Clan Ironworks. So these are some examples, but there are lots of 0 mana artifacts that Tameshi can reanimate very efficiently. Things like Mishra's Bauble, Lion's Eye Diamond, Tormod's Crypt all cost 0 mana and can sacrifice themselves for value. And Tameshi can recur them from your graveyard very efficiently. And you can even focus on artifact creatures, since Tameshi can recur any artifact, not just non-creature ones. The Hope of Girapur, Gingerbrute, Burnished Heart, these are all examples of artifact creatures that can sacrifice themselves for value, and Tameshi can recur them from your graveyard so that you can use them over and over again. It's kind of like playing with Emry in the command zone, but you also have access to white, which is pretty great. So that is Tameshi, Reality Architect. And again, I think there's several different directions you can go in when building around this commander. I really like the design on this one, since it doesn't tell you exactly how to play with it. As a deck builder, you'll get to use a lot of problem solving and your own personal aesthetic to get your Tameshi deck working exactly how you want it to. Now, I also like that Tameshi is doing a few things that are pretty unusual for Azorius, like Graveyard Recursion, even if it's just for artifacts and enchantments, and that Landfall support. But that's all I have for today. Let me know in the comments what you think about Tameshi, Reality Architect, or any other commanders or other cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty that you're interested in. Or even better, share your discussion in the channel's new Discord server. Again, you can see the link in the description for the invite, and the Discord is open to everyone. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.